Chronic hunger is measured in several different ways, depending on the income of the family, the food supply to the country, the distribution of income, and interviews of families to ask if they have had shortages of food in the last day, week, month, year. So there are many different measures of chronic hunger, but there's only one measure of stunting. Chronic hunger, there are probably about 200 definitions, and they are not all consistent, but they generally agree in estimating that hundreds of millions of people are chronically hungry. There is one definition. It's based on a study that the World Health Organization did over 6 years with several thousand children from families, middle-class families, with exclusive breastfeeding for the first half year to a year, non-smoking mothers, where the children were well nourished. This was a reference population from North America, South America, Europe, Africa, East Asia, and South Asia, so all parts of the world. And they measured the children's length or height, depending on whether the baby could stand, and the weight every week for the first year, and then every 2 weeks, and then every month, and then every quarter, I believe, up to age 5 years. That provides a reference population of well-nourished children at each age. And at each age, the distribution of height follows a roughly bell-shaped curve, a normal distribution. So the definition of stunting now is if a child falls 2 standard deviations below the middle of that normal distribution, the child is said to be stunted. So height is a measure of chronic undernutrition, whereas wasting is a measure of acute undernutrition, recent lack of food. It means that the child's weight at a given age is low. The child is very thin. A child can be stunted and wasted, or stunted and not wasted, okay? So the reliable indicator that's universally used for stunting as a measure of chronic undernutrition in children is more than 2 standard deviations shorter than expected at that age if the child was nourished well. %43 of the cereal grains, so now I'm just talking about grains, wheat, maize, rice, barley, these are the grains. 43%, less than half, goes into human mouths. 35% goes into animals that wealthy people feed in order that they may eat meat. So 43 plus 35, I think it's 78. That leaves 22%. 22% goes into machines to provide products and services for wealthy people. For example, in the United States, it is a federal law that 10% of the petroleum that goes into my gas tank in my car must be ethanol from plants. Ethanol is ethyl alcohol. So a good part of our corn crop, instead of feeding people, is making the cars run. Other uses include starches for men's shirts and printer inks for soybean inks that are used in cartridges. People advertise this as sustainable, but it means that the soybeans, instead of feeding people, are feeding the printer in the office. There are many other plastics, many other examples. The largest number of chronically undernourished people are in South Asia, but the highest proportion of chronically undernourished people, the highest percentage in the population, is in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa. There is a hunger belt around the middle of the tropical world, and it goes from West Africa across to East Africa, across to South Asia, India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, and over into Eastern Asia. That's where chronic hunger is. Food and Agriculture Organization and the World Health Organization tried to answer your question. And there are three classes of causes. So there's the larger context. If we think of chronic hunger as the center of a circle, the larger context is political. Does the government care about whether its people have food? It's economic. Is the system arranged to be productive? Is there infrastructure to get food to markets? So there's a larger context. Then there are the conditions in a community. Is the soil in this African community fertile? In many places, the soil is not fertile. If it's not fertile, do they have access to fertilizers? Is there a way to bring fertilizers to the place? Is there something else they can make? What are the rules about trade? And then there are the conditions in the family. In many families, when protein comes into the house, like an egg, one egg. There's one egg in the house. Who gets it? Normally, the man of the house gets the protein. If there's any extra, it goes to the mother. If there's any extra after that, it goes to the son. If there's any left after that, it goes to the daughter. So family traditions and customs make a huge difference in who gets food that they need to develop. And unfortunately, many girls are chronically undernourished, in part because of these traditions. Well, there are many things that we can do. Many, many things. And there are many concrete programs. It's been shown experimentally that if you offer children in poor families a food reward for attending school, the parents will send them to school instead of keeping the girls home to clean the house and the boys home to take care of the goats and sheep and cattle. So it's very inexpensive. Since food is abundant, it's actually inexpensive. And then you get two things for one. One is you get food into the household, and you educate the children. And I think education is a very fundamental part of dealing with chronic undernutrition of children especially. In many households, mothers don't know how to feed children properly. And I could give examples of that. But so that's one thing. But what I'm advocating in the work that I'm doing now is that governments float bonds. A bond, I don't know if you know what a bond is, a financial contract between you and me. I want to build a bridge. I'm a government, let's say. I want to build a bridge or a highway or a port, or I want to feed children, but I don't have the money. You have the money. So we make a contract. You give me $1 million, thank you very much, and I agree to pay you 5% interest every year for 30 years. At the end of the 30 years, I give you your $1 million back. And you have this interest all the time. That's a bond, okay? And there have been very recent studies at the World Bank to show that the rate of return in increased productivity of children who were, if children are stunted, they're less productive, they get educated less, and they're less productive as workers in adulthood. So if you can stop the stunting, you can increase the economic product of the country, but it takes 20 years to go from a baby to a worker. So you need long-term bonds, long-term thinking. So what I'm proposing is bonds to enable governments to invest in feeding the children. Incomes will go up, the government can tax the incomes, pay the interest out of the, and pay back the loans, pay back the bonds at maturity out of the increase in the productivity of children who have been fed instead of being starved chronically. Because we know that stunting, first of all, undernutrition is responsible for the deaths of about 45% of children under 5. And doctors have looked in the brains of normal children who die from some accident and children who have been stunted. And the brains are different. They don't have the connections in the stunted brains. They can't learn. So people can learn better. We know that people who aren't stunted learn better than children who are stunted. They're more productive, but it takes time to get the rewards of that. And my suggestion is that we give children the opportunity to be fully human, like you and me. We have the chance because our brains are working. But stunted children by the age of 3, it's finished. They don't have the chance. So the consequences of stunting are severe for the health of the individual, but extend to the child's health throughout life. They die younger. They are more susceptible to other diseases. They extend to the capacity to learn. The consequences extend to a society's capacity to innovate. How do you change if people can't learn new things? You can't change. You're stuck. So And according to these recent estimates from the World Bank, the stunting of children in the past reduces the gross domestic product of developing countries by about 7%. That's a big impact on the total product of a society. So governments have the opportunity to get that 7% back by investing small amounts of money with a 15-to-1 benefit to cost ratio. That is, for every dollar you spend on nutrition interventions, you get $15 back in increased productivity. In my opinion, we are nowhere near that limit. I have studied the history of attempts to estimate the limits of productivity of food and the limits that the earth can support of population. And again, people have said, we're at the limit. For example, Malthus in 1798 put forward the idea that population grows until it's stopped by constrained food. At that time, there were fewer than 1 billion people on the earth. He completely failed to foresee the Industrial Revolution of the 19th century, 1800s onward. He completely failed to foresee the role of chemistry in agriculture. He didn't foresee the Green Revolution, the role of fertilizers and irrigation and new crop varieties. But there's always a worry. We don't have an assurance about the future. Fortunately, the population growth rate is slowing. It's coming down. We're still growing by 80 million people a year, but the rate of growth, the percentage increase, has come down a lot. And if we plan, it's reasonable to hope that we can feed all the people well. We know that today we can feed many more billions than we are feeding. As you mentioned, we can feed 10 to 13 billion people with just the grain, and then we make a lot of other food too. So there isn't any excuse for 1 person in 9 to be chronically hungry. We've got the food. It's not production that's the problem. It's enabling people to earn so that they can get their own food.